All right, so about a year ago, I uploaded a video titled The Horrors of Working Retail, where I pretty much go over some of the craziest slash weirdest things I've seen during my 5 years of working in customer service. You know, things like people getting arrested in the store, people making loud and inappropriate scenes, people threatening to take my life away over small misunderstandings, things like that, right? Well, needless to say, it ended up doing pretty well, at least by my channel standards. So I figured I'd make a part 2, because at this point in my life, I literally have an endless pit of these kinds of stories. So without further ado, grab some popcorn, grab a drink, grab your mom and dad, and let's begin The Horrors of Working Retail, Volume 2. All right, so when I was still working at my very first job, we had an area that we used for keeping all of our shopping carts in order. And since my town is pretty much hot as balls all year round, from time to time homeless people would chill there for a bit because, you know, it was nice and shady. However, they'd typically leave once the sun went down and we'd never see them again. Except on this particular day, I was heading inside the store so I could clock in, and as I'm walking in, I see this guy in a sleeping bag on the ground up against the wall, which was nothing out of the ordinary because homeless people are a dime a dozen where I live, and I figured he'd leave after a bit just like the others. Except the whole day eventually goes by, and as I'm leaving the store to go home, he was still there in the exact same position, which I now thought was a little weird because I assumed he'd eventually get up to go find water or something. But no, it was as if he hadn't moved a muscle all day. But as odd as this whole thing was, I just decided to keep going, because at that point there was pretty much nothing I could do. But anyways, eventually the next day rolls around, and as I'm walking into work, I noticed that the guy is gone, which made me feel a little relieved because at that point I figured he was fine the whole time and was just taking a very long nap or something. Except unfortunately for me, I was completely wrong, because as soon as I clocked in for work and stepped foot onto the sales floor, this older woman approaches me and goes, "Excuse me, young man, is it true that there was a dead body outside of the store yesterday?" And I laughingly go, "Dead body? There was no dead body. What are you talking about?" But after about a minute, I eventually put 2 and 2 together, and I realized that she was talking about the homeless guy. But just to confirm whether or not it was true, because people like to spread rumors, I asked my manager about it. And, you know, sadly, she confirmed that the whole thing was true and that she had found him that morning, and he was indeed no longer with us. So, yeah, rest in peace, Mr. Homeless Man. And I hope that you're in a better place now. All right, so aside from dead bodies being found outside the store, I kid you not, I have come into contact with probably some of the nastiest people in existence while working in customer service. Like one time I was helping this older guy who was buying a bunch of fragrances and stuff, and at first glance, nothing about him struck me as odd or unusual, because at that point, I had seen some very interesting individuals, so I knew what crazy or weird looked like. And this guy didn't fit the description at all. Except to my surprise, the longer this guy stood in front of me, the more I began to realize that he smelled like shit. And when I say he smelled like shit, I mean he literally smelled like shit. Like, I wasn't alive during the bubonic plague era or anything, but if I had to imagine what it smelled like back then, it probably smelled like him. And I know I sound really mean and insensitive for saying this, but I kid you not, this guy had the worst body odor I have ever smelled on another human being. Like, this guy's body odor was so bad, I could literally see it coming off of him. And to make matters even worse, when he eventually reached his arm out to hand me his money, the smell wafted directly into my face, and it felt like I was being attacked. It was so bad, I literally had to step back for a second, which naturally made him kind of uncomfortable, but it is what it is, okay? And, you know, thankfully, he never came back after that, but if he did, I probably would have hit him with the 1-2 wombo combo and doused his entire body in, like, Axe body spray or something. Aside from him, though, I have had a plethora, and I mean a plethora of women give me sweaty, crispy, dirty, wadded up cash that was sitting inside of their bras to pay for their items, which before I started working in retail, figured was just something that happened in TV shows or movies, because I feel like that's a pretty common cliche. But no, this is very much a real thing that people do. And for any of you gooners watching this, no, these women do not look how you'd want them to look, okay? It's not like Sydney Sweeney came up to me and gave me some of her boob money. In fact, 9 times out of 10, they'll look like freaking Roz from Monsters, Inc., which is pretty much the only reason why it's an issue for me. All All right, so if you've ever worked in retail before, you'll know that you're pretty much always going to run into some sort of shoplifter, regardless of where you work, okay? And I mean, most of the time it'll be something relatively innocent, like a guy walking out with a few items, or some teenage kids stealing candy or something. But let's just say there's a spectrum when it comes to people stealing things, and let's just say the other end of the spectrum is 100 times worse. So one time I was working, ringing up customers or whatever, and I eventually see this big family of about 5 to 6 people, including 2 young children who were probably about 8 or 9, and they were each holding one of those big black trash bags you pretty much see everywhere. And I shit you not, they come in and they just start piling absolutely anything and everything they came into contact with into these bags, okay? Including the young children. I'm talking shoes, t-shirts, accessories, toys, ectica, you name it. And then after about 20 minutes of pillaging, they all got the hell out of there. And we all watched as they peeled off in a big white SUV, which was really disappointing at the time because the state I live in was, let's just say, very lenient on shoplifters. So there was pretty much nothing we could do or say about it. Not that I would have if given the chance anyways though, because I'm not trying to get my shit blown smooth off over a pair of Air Force Ones. Alright, so I know I already went over people who shoplift, but another big thing to watch out for is people who scam. Except I'm not going to go over all the different methods people use because quite frankly, there are way too many to count, and I don't want YouTube to think I'm giving people any ideas, so I'm just gonna go over the biggest one I've seen, which is the infamous store credit scam. Allow me to explain. A person walks into a store. They pick an item off the shelf. They walk over to customer service and tell them that they purchased the item and want to return it, when they never purchased it at all. Except without a receipt, they can only get store credit, but they don't care because it's still technically free money. The only catch is the fact that most places require an ID scan for non-receipted returns because they know people will try to steal merchandise this way. So by scanning the customer's ID, it'll limit how many non-receipted returns someone does. Except despite the ID scan, this has literally become the #1 way people steal shit, and it's really disgusting to watch. However, once again, there's a return limit, so they can only do this so many times until it gets declined. And when they finally get declined, it's the funniest thing ever. There was this one time in particular where this dude's non-receipted return got declined, and he started cussing out my coworker and manager who were helping him at the time. And he tried to claim that we were quote unquote stealing his information because we had to scan his ID. So after a few minutes of him yelling, he eventually calls my manager a bitch, and then he tells us all to go f ourselves. Except luckily for us, he eventually does leave. And I see his goofy ass speed walk through the automatic doors. Except after this, my coworker at the time who was just helping him turns to me and says in sort of a laughing / nervous tone, Sonny, I'm literally shaking. Because naturally, you'd be pretty shaken up from something like that. And I kid you not, after she says this, I hear a voice go, "Oh, so you think this is fucking funny? You think this is a fucking joke?" So I turn to my right, and it's the guy again, which, needless to say, tripped me the hell out because I literally saw him leave the store no more than 5 seconds ago. So I don't know if he learned how to fast travel or something during that time, but it was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, even to this day. But, luckily for us, my manager told him that if he didn't leave immediately, she was going to call the cops. So he eventually got the hell out of there. And we never saw Mr. Scammer Man ever again. And thank God, because that dude was furious. Like, good Lord, dude, just buy a stress ball or something, man. Or apply for a job while you're at it. Okay, so next up on this list, we have people who bring their pets inside the store. And for anyone watching this who's a pet owner, I get that you love your dog or, cat or whatever other animal you might own, but do you really need to take it with you into Walmart? Especially when there's a high chance of it taking a shit in the middle of the store and killing the vibe for basically everyone around you. Because yes, I've seen this happen a plethora of times. But just to set the record straight, if you're someone that requires a service dog to complete everyday errands because you're physically unable to do them alone, that's fine, okay? I totally get that. But 9 times out of 10, the dogs I see customers bringing inside are not service dogs and are only there in the first place because the owner wanted to draw attention to themselves. And to make matters even worse, sometimes it won't even be a dog. For example, there was this one time where this lady brought in her pet goat. And yes, you heard me correctly. She brought in a fucking goat. And they let him stand on my counter as I was bagging their items like, get that shit away from me. And albeit it was a baby, so it's not like it took up that much space, but still. And then there was this other time where a lady brought in her pet parrot, which ended up being an absolute nightmare because if you know anything about parrots or just birds in general, you'll know that they like to make a lot of noise. So you can only imagine how painful it was having to hear a bird scream endlessly throughout the store for almost 45 minutes. And then being the one to help the owner of the bird pay for her items when she was finally ready to check out. I really should have taken school more seriously. All right, so last but certainly not least, we have people who refuse to leave the store even after the store is closed, which is probably my least favorite thing about working in retail. Because just picture this for a second. Imagine you just worked an 8-hour shift. You've been on your feet all day, scanning hundreds of items, dealing with numbers and, convoluted transactions. And on top of all that, putting up with people's unnecessary bullshit. You're now both mentally and physically exhausted, and you are ready to go home. Except, unfortunately for you, even though the store is now closed and you're technically scheduled to leave at a certain time, you're not allowed to go home yet. And why are you not allowed to go home yet, you might ask? Well, it's really simple, actually. Because there's still people walking around the store that refuse to leave. And before someone comments something cheeky like,
But Sonny, if there's still people walking around the store even when you guys are closed, why don't you just ask them to leave? It's not that hard, you fat, ugly, gay loser.
Yes, I know it all seems really self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised how hard it actually is to get certain people to leave. And I'm going to tell you guys about the worst instance I've seen of this. So there was this one time a few months back where this lady came in about 30 minutes before we were supposed to close, and she just started absolutely piling anything and everything you could think of into one of our tiny ass shopping carts. Like, this lady had so much stuff, I shit you not, she was leaving a trail of clothes on the ground behind her as she was walking around the store, okay? It was absolutely horrendous. And the worst part about this whole thing was the fact that we all told her countless times that she needed to go to customer service to pay for her items because the store was about to close, and that our power was eventually going to shut off because it's on a timer. But surprise, surprise, she completely ignored basically every warning we gave her. In fact, she acted like she didn't even hear anything we said. But luckily for my coworkers and I, she eventually comes up to customer service to pay for her mountain of shit. Except, unfortunately for me, this wasn't just a one and done transaction, because to paint a picture for you guys, our store closes at 10 o'clock, which is when we started ringing her up, except we're all supposed to leave at 10:30 because we spend that extra 30 minutes straightening up the store. But we didn't get to do any of that because she didn't leave until 10:55. And the reason she stayed almost an hour past closing was because for almost the entire transaction, she was indecisive about basically every item she was buying, and had me add and then take off countless items because she couldn't make up her fucking mind. And needless to say, at that point, we were all absolutely livid. Especially me, because I was the one who had to ring up her 500 items. And to make matters even worse, once the whole thing was over with, she then started begging us to let her buy more things. And she even tried going behind the counter to grab more shit. But unfortunately for her, at that point, I was now completely over it. And even though I wasn't supposed to, and even though I probably could have gotten in a lot of trouble for this, I basically told her to get the fuck out, and that she wasted a good hour of our precious time we could have spent doing absolutely anything else. And then after that, I kind of sort of threw her receipt at her, but it is what it is. She eventually left, and we never saw her again after that. And thank God, because if she ever did come back, I'd probably get arrested for assault with a deadly weapon.